You've been lied to about lust. Beware of it. The hidden deception of lust. A king's fatal glance. It never starts with fire, it begins with a spark. Small, seemingly innocent. A glance, a lingering thought. A single message that should have been left unread. And in that moment, the first step toward destruction is taken. Jaden Carter never imagined his life would come to this. He was a man of God, a shepherd to his flock, a voice of wisdom in a world drowning in temptation. But even shepherds can be led astray. Even leaders can fall. It didn't happen overnight. It started with a moment of weakness, a glance at something that should have been ignored, a message that should have gone unanswered, a thought that should have been cast away. The devil never knocks loudly, he whispers. And so the battle within began. Thousands of years earlier in the Golden Kingdom of Israel, another man, greater than Jaden, a warrior, a king, a chosen one, stood at the edge of his own temptation. But he didn't know it yet. David had conquered armies, slain giants, and ruled with wisdom. Yet he was unprepared for the war that was about to be waged. Not on a battlefield, but within his own soul. A single glance. That's all it took. From his rooftop, David saw her. Bathsheba, a woman bathing in the privacy of her courtyard, a woman who was not his to have, a woman who belonged to another. But desire is a cunning beast. It does not announce itself as danger. It comes wrapped in beauty, in curiosity, in the illusion of harmless indulgence. David was not a fool. He knew the law. He knew the commandments. He knew what was right and what was wrong. And yet, knowing was not enough. Because in that moment, something shifted. The king was no longer in control. The man was. He could have turned away. He could have silenced the voice in his head that whispered, "What would it hurt to inquire? Just to know her name? Just to see if she is married? Just to..." But sin does not thrive on giant leaps. It thrives on small steps. Tiny justifications, rationalizations disguised as harmless curiosity. And so the king gave an order. "Bring her to me." And just like that, the wheels of destruction began to turn. What David didn't know was that this one moment, this one decision, would set off a chain reaction that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It wouldn't just be a fleeting sin, a forgotten mistake. No, this would become the turning point in his legacy. The moment that would cost him more than he could ever imagine. Just like Jaden Carter didn't know what was coming when he responded to that message. The road to ruin never looks like ruin at first. It looks like pleasure, like fulfillment, like something that was always meant to be. But what if I told you, this wasn't just about David? This wasn't just about Jaden? What if I told you that the same deception that led them astray is whispering to you too? The tragedy of lust is that it never announces its cost up front. If it did, no one would take the first step. No one would give in to the first glance. No one would answer that message. No one would send for Bathsheba. But sin never tells you the price, not at first. It lets you believe the lie. It lets you believe you are in control. But David was never in control, not really, because the moment he gave in, the moment he reached for something that was never meant for him, the consequences became unstoppable. Bathsheba was married to Uriah, one of David's most loyal soldiers, and now she was pregnant with David's child. What was meant to be a fleeting indulgence turned into a crisis. And in that moment, David faced a choice: confess or cover it up. One path led to redemption, the other to destruction. If you think sin is satisfied with a single moment, you are wrong. Sin is never satisfied. It always demands more. One lie turns into two, one cover-up becomes 100, and before you know it, you are no longer the master, you are the slave. David sent Uriah to the battlefield, but not just anywhere. He sent him to the front lines, where the fighting was fiercest, where death was certain. And then As if washing his hands of the matter, David waited. Days passed, then weeks, and finally word came. Uriah was dead. David thought it was over. He thought he had managed to bury his sin along with Uriah. But sin does not stay buried. It rises, it spreads, it poisons everything it touches. And the judgment of God was coming. Jaden Carter thought the same, that no one would ever know about the secret messages, that no one would ever find out about the meetings in the dimly lit back office of the church, that no one would ever see the slow unraveling of a man who once stood for righteousness. But secrets never stay secrets, and sin never stays small. Nathan, the prophet, stood before David. "You are the man," he declared, "the man who had taken what was not his, the man who had tried to hide his sin under the weight of lies and deception, the man who thought he could escape the consequences, but there was no escape." And just like David, Jaden would soon stand exposed before his own congregation. The whispers had grown louder, the evidence was undeniable, the trust was broken. And when the truth finally came out, it was not just his reputation that fell, it was his family, his ministry, his very identity. David's house would never be the same. The sword would never leave his family. His sons would rise against him. His kingdom would fracture. And the child conceived in sin, he would not survive. Jaden lost everything too. His wife left. His children wouldn't look at him the same. His church doors closed. The pulpit where he once stood with confidence was now empty. And all because of a single moment that he thought was harmless. Lust does not come for the weak alone. It comes for the strong, for the powerful, for the chosen ones. It does not care about your title. It does not care about your reputation. It does not care how close you once were to God. It only cares about one thing, your destruction. And it will use whatever means necessary to get there. David did not know the cost of his glance. Jaden did not know the cost of his message. Do you? Because what if I told you, the cost is far greater than you ever imagined? The screen fades to black, leaving the question unanswered. For now, the first lie, it's just a thought. The greatest deception of lust is not in its final act, but in its beginning. It does not appear as destruction. It does not come as a raging fire. It begins as a whisper, as a suggestion, as a thought so small that you convince yourself it doesn't matter. David was not planning to sin that night. He did not stand on his rooftop looking for trouble. But then his eyes wandered, and there she was, Bathsheba. She was not searching for him. She was not calling to him. She was simply living her life, unaware that in this moment she had become the object of a king's desire. And David? He could have turned away. He could have shut his eyes, gone back inside, and dismissed the thought before it took root. But he didn't. Instead, he rationalized. Looking isn't sinning, he told himself. I'm only admiring her beauty. I have not touched her. I have not spoken a word. What harm is there in a thought? And so, David did what millions before and after him would do. He let the thought linger. He entertained it. He did not resist it. And in doing so, he gave it power. A single glance turned into a second. A second became a minute became a craving, and a craving becomes an action. Tell me, how many times have you believed this same lie? How many times have you convinced yourself that a thought is harmless, that an image on a screen means nothing, that scrolling through seductive pictures on social media is just passing time? It's just a thought, it's just a glance, it's just a little curiosity. But what if I told you, this is where destruction begins? Jaden Carter told himself the same thing. The messages started as nothing, small talk, encouragement, a woman in his congregation saying she enjoyed his sermon. He didn't see the danger. He had no intention of doing anything wrong. And then one day, Marissa sent him a picture. Nothing explicit, just her in a dress, asking for his opinion. Do you think this is appropriate for church? She asked. Jaden could have dismissed it. He could have told her it wasn't his place. But instead, he stared at the picture longer than he should have. His mind wandered where it shouldn't have. And instead of shutting it down, he let the thought live. He entertained it. He told himself, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just responding as a friend. And so he typed back, you look great. I'm sure it'll be fine. A harmless compliment, right? Wrong. Every downfall has a beginning, and every tragedy starts with a choice. But what if I told you that most people don't recognize the moment their fate is sealed? They don't hear the chains locking. They don't feel the trap closing. Not yet. Because deception doesn't appear as destruction, it appears as opportunity. David had won countless battles. He had built a legacy of power, wisdom, and devotion to God. But the battle that would cost him the most wasn't fought with swords or armies. It was fought in his mind. And in this moment, standing in his palace, hearing the name Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, he faced a war greater than any he had ever fought. But here's the twist. He didn't even know he was in a war. Because the greatest deception of sin is the illusion of control. The belief that you can entertain a desire without consequence, that you can step to the edge of a cliff without falling, that you can feed a craving without becoming a slave to it. David heard the warning, she is the wife of Uriah. He should have turned back. The road to escape was still open, the door to repentance still unlocked. But the human heart is an expert at suppressing truth when it interferes with desire. And so, he rationalized, I'm just talking to her. I'm the king, I can handle this. No one has to know. But when has no one has to know ever been true? What if I told you that every secret sin has a day of reckoning, that every hidden indulgence will one day stand in the light? Jaden Carter was making the same mistake. The late-night messages had become a habit, the private jokes, the subtle compliments. It felt harmless. It felt controlled. But then, his wife found the messages. She didn't confront him, not yet. She just watched, observed, noticed the way he smiled at his phone a little too often, the way he left the room when a certain notification popped up, the way his sermons on purity had started sounding hollow. And the silence of suspicion is often louder than accusation. David was about to face the same silence. The moment Bathsheba walked into his palace, the atmosphere shifted. The messengers glanced at each other, their expressions uneasy. Servants moved cautiously, sensing something was off, because sin, even before it is acted upon, carries a weight, a tension, a disturbance in the air. But David ignored it. And that was his first real mistake. Not the glance, not the thought, but the moment he silenced the voice of God in favor of his own desire. And you? How many times have you done the same? How many times has God whispered, this is not for you, and you ignored it? How many times have you felt that stirring in your spirit, that warning deep in your gut, and convinced yourself it was just your imagination? Bathsheba stood before him now, the wife of Uriah, but David no longer saw Uriah, he only saw what he wanted. The voice of reason was fading, the voice of justification was growing louder. She wouldn't have come if she didn't want to be here. Maybe this is meant to be. What harm could one night do? And right there, at that moment, the trap snapped shut. Because what if I told you that once you cross a certain line, there is no going back? That once you step into darkness, you are no longer the one in control. That from this point forward, David wasn't the hunter anymore, he was the prey. Jaden Carter stood in his office, staring at his wife's phone in horror. She had left it on the counter, the screen still glowing with a single notification, a message from Marissa. A message he had never seen before. We can't keep doing this, it's too dangerous. Your wife suspects something. His blood ran cold. He thought he had been careful. He thought he had been in control. But now the truth was staring him in the face. He had already lost control. The sin he thought he had contained had started to spread. And David? He had no idea that in this moment, the same thing was happening to him. That the decision he was about to make would not stay contained. that it would spiral, that it would cost him more than he could ever afford to pay. Because lust is never satisfied, it always demands more. And the moment you give in, you are no longer writing your own story. The story is writing you. David took a breath. He stepped forward. He reached out his hand. And with that single motion, his fate was sealed. And now I ask you, what will you do? Because whether you realize it or not, you are standing in the same moment. The trap is tightening. The warning has been given. The door to escape is still open. But it won't be open forever. A silent battle. It doesn't happen all at once. You don't wake up one day and feel like a different person. You don't suddenly lose your faith, your convictions, or your connection to God. No, it happens slowly, quietly, like a whisper turning into silence, like a flickering flame that over time suffocates under the weight of darkness. Lust does not announce its victory. It erodes your resistance, one compromise at a time. David was still the king. He still worshipped. He still wrote psalms of devotion. He still held the title of a man after God's own heart. But what happens when the heart begins to harden? Because at this moment, in the privacy of his chambers, his conscience was still speaking. It was still pleading, still warning. But the problem is, when you feed desire and starve conviction, conviction begins to fade. Have you ever felt it? That slow detachment? That eerie quietness where God once spoke loudly? That numbness where conviction once burned? David was in a war now. A war no one could see. A war no one else knew was happening. But make no mistake, this was a battle for his soul, and he was losing. As he paced the room, waiting for Bathsheba to arrive, he could still hear it. That inner voice. That final warning. You still have time to stop this. You still have time to turn away. You still have time to walk in righteousness. But then another voice spoke, a quieter voice, a more seductive voice, the voice of justification. You are the king. No one will ever know. This is nothing compared to all the good you've done. And this is how it happens, isn't it? The battle isn't fought in the moment of sin. It's fought in the moments leading up to it. The moments where conviction and desire wrestle for control. And in those moments, whoever you feed the most wins. David had spent too much time feeding his desire. And now his conscience was losing its voice. Jaden Carter sat in church, but he wasn't really there. The worship music played, the hands lifted, the voices soared in praise, but he felt nothing. Where was the fire? Where was the presence? Where was the God he had once felt so deeply? He knew the answer, he just didn't want to face it. Once he would have wept in repentance during worship, now he barely felt a thing. Once he would have shuddered at the thought of impurity, now it felt normal. His conscience had become numb, his prayers mechanical, his devotion an empty routine. He still preached, he still prayed, but deep down, something inside him was deadening. And the scariest part? He didn't even miss what was lost. What happens when conviction fades? What happens when sin no longer feels like sin? What happens when the presence of God feels like a distant memory and you can't even pinpoint the moment it started slipping away? Bathsheba was in the palace now. The moment had arrived. But this wasn't just about David and Bathsheba anymore. This was about something far greater. This was about a man who had spent his life listening to God and was now choosing not to hear him. God wasn't silent. No, the problem was that David had tuned him out. And when you ignore conviction long enough, you start to believe that silence is permission. But silence is never permission. Sometimes it's the final warning before the fall. And what about you? How many times have you silenced the voice of God? How many times have you brushed off conviction, telling yourself it's not that serious? How many times have you traded your spiritual sensitivity for temporary satisfaction? Here's the real danger of lust. It doesn't just destroy your purity, it destroys your ability to hear God. And That is a price far greater than you ever imagined. Jaden Carter looked around the church, watching people experience a presence he could no longer feel, and for the first time in a long time, fear gripped him. Real fear. Not of exposure, not of consequences, but of what he had lost. Was it too late? Could he ever get back what had been stolen? And David? He was about to find out what it felt like to step into the darkness willingly, to choose silence over conviction, to let desire win. And now the question remains, what happens when conviction fades completely? You've been lied to about lust. Beware of it. When desire becomes action, every great fall begins with a single step. Every disaster starts with a moment of decision. And here in the king's palace, a choice is about to be made. A choice that will change everything. David had gone too far to turn back now, or at least that's what he told himself. He had silenced his conscience, ignored the warnings, and justified his desires. And now there was nothing left but to act. No more inner battles. No more second-guessing. The moment of temptation had passed. Now came the moment of indulgence. Bring her to me. The command left his lips before he could even consider stopping himself. The messengers did not question him. They did not hesitate. He was the king, and his word was final. But imagine for a moment what those messengers were thinking. They had seen the hesitation in David's eyes. They had heard the weight in his voice. They had witnessed the war within him. And yet they obeyed. Because here is the truth. Sin does not happen in isolation. Every compromise, every failure, every act of disobedience leaves ripples in the lives of others. And whether David realized it or not, the moment he gave in, he was not just destroying himself, he was pulling others into his downfall. Jaden Carter knew he should have left the hotel lobby the moment he saw her. He should have turned away, walked out, repented. But he didn't. He was too far in now, too deep. The text messages had led to late-night calls. The calls had led to secret meetings. And now, here they were. A decision had to be made. But was it even a decision anymore? Because once you let sin control your mind, your body simply followed. He watched as she stepped off the elevator, her eyes searching for him. She smiled when she saw him, and in that moment, Jaden realized something terrifying. He no longer felt conflicted. The conviction was gone. The hesitation was gone. The battle was over. He had lost. Bathsheba entered the palace, unaware of what was truly unfolding. She had been summoned by the king. What could she do? To refuse a king's invitation was not just unwise, it was dangerous. She did not know why she was here, but David did, and David no longer cared about what was right. Lust had already won. Now it was simply collecting its reward. What happens when an imagined sin becomes reality? What happens when the fantasy crosses into existence? For a moment, it feels like victory. For a moment, it feels like satisfaction. But the thing about sin is, it never delivers what it promises. It lures you in with the illusion of pleasure, but leaves you with the reality of emptiness. David was about to find this out firsthand. The night passed, the act was done. The king lay in his chamber, staring at the ceiling. And in that moment, he should have felt fulfilled. He should have felt satisfied. But instead, he felt nothing. Have you ever been there? Have you ever indulged in something you thought would bring you joy, only to feel more broken than before? Have you ever convinced yourself that once you gave in, everything would be fine, only to realize that nothing felt right? David turned over in his bed, but sleep would not come. Because there is a moment after sin that no one talks about. The silence. The moment when the weight of what you've done begins to settle. The moment when pleasure turns to regret. The moment when the illusion shatters and all that remains is the truth. And the truth was he had crossed a line he could never uncross. Jaden Carter sat on the edge of the hotel bed, his head in his hands. He had done what he swore he would never do. The excitement, the thrill, the temptation. It had all faded the moment it was over. Now there was only emptiness, a hollow space in his chest where conviction used to live. But Here's the thing about sin. It is never satisfied. It never ends where you think it will. It does not let you walk away clean, because what David did not know, what Jaden did not know, was that the moment they gave in, they set something in motion that could not be undone. What does sin demand next? Because make no mistake, sin is never content with just one night. It always comes back for more. You've been lied to about lust. Beware of it. The illusion of control. The most dangerous lie sin ever told is this: you can control it, that you can indulge just once and walk away untouched, that you can feed lust just a little and remain the same person, that you can keep your integrity while living in compromise. But what if I told you sin does not negotiate? It does not accept part-time commitment. The moment you invite it in, it begins building its empire within you. David thought he had it handled. He was the king, after all. He had faced giants, led armies, conquered cities. He was a man of wisdom, a man of influence, a man who had been chosen by God himself. Surely, if anyone could commit a sin and walk away unscathed, it was him. And isn't that what we all believe? That we're the exception? That we're stronger than those who have fallen before us? That we can control what others could not? David woke up the morning after his sin with Bathsheba, expecting life to continue as usual. He carried on with his duties. He still sat on his throne. He still played his harp, still lifted his voice in worship. He told himself that what happened the night before was behind him, but sin doesn't stay behind. It follows, it lingers, it festers in the dark, growing roots in silence. Days passed, then weeks. The guilt, though quiet, never fully left him. He ignored it. He told himself he was fine, but then a message arrived, and in one sentence his illusion of control shattered. I am with child. Bathsheba was pregnant. And just like that, David's private sin had become a public problem. What was supposed to be a moment of pleasure had now become a crisis. And suddenly, the stakes were higher than ever. Jason Michaels had built his entire brand on faith. He was the Christian influencer everyone admired, the man with the perfect image, the powerful sermons, the picture-perfect family. Millions followed his teachings, hung onto his words, modeled their lives after his guidance. And yet, behind the curated social media feed, there was another story, one that no one saw, one that he believed he could keep hidden forever. The messages had started innocently enough. Encouragement, advice. I'm just being a mentor, he told himself. But then, a joke turned into flirtation. A late-night text turned into a secret meeting. And before he knew it, he had crossed a line. He told himself it was just this once. He convinced himself that as long as no one knew, it wasn't real, that he could manage this, control it, keep it compartmentalized. But then, the messages leaked. One moment, he was untouchable. The next, his name was everywhere. For all the wrong reasons. Sin always overpromises and underdelivers. It tells you that you are in control, when in reality you are already a prisoner. David sat in stunned silence, rereading Bathsheba's message. His mind raced. What would he do? What could he do? He was the king. Surely he could handle this. Surely there was a way to keep it hidden. He would fix this. He would make it disappear. And this is where the real downfall begins, because the moment you begin managing sin instead of repenting from it, you have already lost. David called for Uriah, Bathsheba's husband. His plan was simple. Bring the man home from war, let him be with his wife, and let the child be assumed as his. Clean, simple, no one would ever know. But sin is never satisfied with just one lie. It always demands another. Uriah returned to Jerusalem, but he did not do what David expected. He refused to sleep in his house while his fellow soldiers were still at war. He slept at the palace gate instead. David's plan was falling apart. The illusion of control was crumbling. So he tried again. He invited Uriah to a feast, got him drunk, hoping he would stumble home. But Uriah still did not go to his wife. He remained faithful to his duty. And in that moment, David realized something. He was not dealing with an average man. He was dealing with a man of integrity, a man who would not be manipulated, a man whose righteousness was now exposing David's sin. And when righteousness stands next to corruption, the corrupted have only two options: repent or remove the righteous. And so David made his choice. If he could not cover his sin, he would bury it. He wrote a letter, a death sentence disguised as a military order. "Send Uriah to the front lines," he wrote, "then withdraw from him, that he may be struck down and die." He sealed the letter, placed it in Uriah's hands, and sent him back to battle, carrying his own execution order. And here is where sin shows its true nature. It never stops at indulgence. It never stops at secrecy. It always escalates. It always demands more. It always takes you further than you ever planned to go. What started as a glance turned into adultery. What started as adultery turned into deception. What started as deception turned into murder. And David? He still thought he had control. The headlines were brutal. Christian influencer exposed in affair scandal. Hypocrisy in the pulpit. Faith leader falls from grace. His emails were flooded. His brand deals dropped. His congregation divided. The reputation he had spent years crafting, gone in an instant. He had thought he could manage it. He had thought he could contain it. But sin always demands to be seen. And the moment you think you have it under control is the moment it controls you completely. David stood on his balcony, staring at the horizon. Uriah was dead now. The problem was gone. Bathsheba would become his wife. The world would move on. Or so he thought. Because what David didn't realize was that while he had been trying to silence his consequences, he had been heard. And someone was coming, a prophet, a reckoning, a voice from God that would expose everything he had tried to hide. Because make no mistake, sin will always be revealed. And when it is, the weight of it is far heavier than you could ever bear. And now, the question remains, not just for David, not just for Jason Michaels, but for you. What secret are you trying to manage? What compromise have you convinced yourself is under control? How long before your house of cards collapses? Because here is the truth. Every hidden sin has a day of exposure. Every illusion of control is only temporary. And when the reckoning comes, will you be ready? The consequences begin. It always starts the same way. A moment of weakness, a fleeting desire, a decision made in secrecy. But what if I told you, sin never stays hidden. It always comes back. It always demands more. And when it does, the cost is always higher than you ever expected. David had convinced himself he was in control. He had silenced his conscience, ignored the warnings, and indulged in his desire. He thought he could leave his sin behind him, move forward as if nothing had happened. But sin does not leave quietly. And now, it was knocking on his door. A message arrived, short, devastating. A few words that carried the weight of a kingdom. "I am pregnant." Bathsheba's message might as well have been a death sentence, because in that moment David realized something chilling. He had not ended this. He had only begun a war he could not afford to lose. His mind raced. This was not a private matter anymore. This was a crisis. If word got out, it would shake the kingdom. He was the anointed king of Israel, the man chosen by God, the one the people looked up to. If they found out, what would they say? What would they think? His reputation, his legacy, his very rule. Everything was at risk. And so, just like every man before and after him who has tried to conceal his sin, David made a fatal decision. He would cover it up. Because here's the truth. Lust never stops at just one sin. It always leads to another, and another, and another, until you look around and realize you're no longer the person you once were. A king's desperation. David paced the floor of his chambers, his thoughts a storm of panic and strategy. He had to fix this. He had to make it go away. And so, he sent for Uriah. Bring him home. Make it look like the child is his. Bury the truth beneath an illusion. And isn't that how we all deal with sin? We think if we cover it up, if we pretend it never happened, if we just create the right narrative, then the truth will disappear. But sin does not disappear. It waits, it lurks, and the more you try to bury it, the deeper it takes root. David welcomed Uriah back from the battlefield with false kindness. He smiled, he praised him, he acted as if this was a gift, a reward for his service. "Go home to your wife," David told him. "Rest. Enjoy your time, you deserve it. But Uriah was a man of honor. He could not bring himself to do it. His men were still at war, fighting, bleeding, dying. How could he return to the comfort of his home while they suffered? And so, he didn't. He slept at the palace gate, refusing to enjoy the pleasures of home while his brothers in arms were still on the battlefield. David's plan had failed, but sin does not accept failure. It demands escalation, a second attempt. The slippery slope of sin. David called for Uriah again. This time he tried a different approach. If morality would not move him, then intoxication would. He got Uriah drunk, believing that in his weakened state, he would stumble home to his wife, do what David needed him to do, and unknowingly take responsibility for a child that was not his. And that's the nature of deception. It never starts with destruction. It starts with small, calculated steps. Lies that feel justified. Manipulations that seem necessary. But Uriah, even in his drunkenness, remained steadfast. He still did not go home. And now David was running out of options. His panic turned to desperation. His desperation turned to something darker. There was one final solution, one way to make this problem disappear. If he couldn't cover it up, he would eliminate the problem entirely. He would kill Uriah. What started as a glance had now led to a murder plot. What began as a private temptation had turned into public deception, and now it would end in blood. David wrote the order with his own hand. Send Uriah to the front lines of battle, then withdraw so that he may be struck down and die. He sealed the letter and placed it in Uriah's hands. The man whose wife he had stolen, the man whose integrity had exposed his own corruption, the man who had done nothing but serve with loyalty and faithfulness. Uriah carried his own death sentence, completely unaware that the very king he served had marked him for death. And here is where sin shows its true nature. It pretends to be harmless. It masquerades as pleasure, but in the end it demands a price. And that price is always higher than you are willing to pay. A modern-day parable. A scandal unfolds. Miles away, in a different time, another man sat in his office, staring at his phone screen with dread. Jonathan Pierce was a well-respected Christian leader, a best-selling author, a voice of faith in a world of compromise. But Jonathan had a secret, a sin he had managed for years. Hidden affairs, private conversations, digital footprints that he thought no one would ever find. But now the message was in front of him. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of destruction. We need to talk. I'm pregnant. The child, Bathsheba's child, David's child, lay still in his crib, his breath weak, his body burning with fever. Every healer had been called, every prayer had been whispered, but the weight of judgment still hung heavy over the household. Because Nathan's words had been clear, the child born to you will die. David had pleaded, had begged, had thrown himself to the ground in desperation. He refused food, refused comfort. He lay in sackcloth, his face to the floor, his cries echoing through the palace halls. The great king of Israel, the man who had once stood unshaken before armies, now lay broken before an invisible force he could not fight. God's judgment. Have you ever felt it? That helplessness, that moment when you realize you have no control, no power, no ability to undo what has already been set in motion? David had wielded control for years. He had commanded men, he had ordered deaths, he had rewritten reality to suit his own desires. But now, as he lay on the cold ground, waiting for a child's final breath, he was powerless. And in that moment, he learned the most painful truth of all. Sin does not just affect the guilty, it affects the innocent. Bathsheba knelt beside the child, her fingers trembling as she placed a damp cloth on his forehead. Her tears fell, but she did not speak. What could she say? She had lost a husband, stolen from her home, and now, the only thing she had left, the only piece of Uriah that remained, was slipping away before her eyes. David's servants stood at a distance watching their king, unsure of what to do. They had never seen him like this. He had always been strong, always decisive, but now he was a man who had met the full weight of consequence, and it was crushing him. The cost of sin isn't always immediate. Here's what no one tells you about sin. It does not demand payment right away. It allows you to believe you have escaped. It allows you to feel safe. It allows you to think that perhaps, just perhaps, you have gotten away with it. Until the day the bill comes due. David had thought he had buried his mistakes, that his repentance had been enough to shield him from the storm. But what if I told you? Forgiveness does not erase consequence. Sin had already taken a man's life, and now it was about to take a child's. And this was the cost David never saw coming. A kingdom watches. The news spread quickly through the palace, through the city, through the kingdom. Whispers in the streets, servants exchanging worried glances, soldiers who once followed David into battle, now speaking in hushed tones. The child of the king is dying. There was no war, no enemy invasion, no political upheaval, but still, the nation felt a weight, a shift in the atmosphere. Because this was no ordinary illness. This was judgment, and the people knew it. What happens when a man of God falls? What happens when the chosen one is struck down by his own actions? The people had once sung songs of David's victories, but now there were no songs. Only silence. Only waiting. The king, who had once stood on a rooftop and claimed what was not his, now lay face down in the dust, pleading for mercy. But mercy had already been given. The judgment was final. The moment no father should face. On the seventh day, the child's cries stopped. The fever broke, not with healing, but with silence. The palace stilled. The air grew thick with unspoken grief, and the servants who had stood at a distance now looked at one another, unsure of what to do. David had not eaten in days. He had not spoken. He had not moved from the ground where he lay in prayer. And now, the moment they had feared had arrived. The child is dead. The words were whispered, hesitant, fearful. Because who would dare be the one to tell the king? Who would be the one to confirm what his heart already knew? David heard the whispers. He saw their faces. He did not need to be told. He knew. He exhaled, a breath so heavy it felt like it carried his soul with it, and then, slowly, he rose. The servant stepped back, uncertain. Would he rage? Would he weep? Would he collapse? David did none of those things. He stood, he turned, and he walked away. He entered the place of worship. He knelt before God, and there he worshipped. Because here is the final truth. Sin has consequences, but God is still God. Sin destroys, but it does not destroy the throne of heaven. Judgment comes, but so does mercy. And David? David still had breath in his lungs, which meant his story was not over. A modern-day parallel, a father's regret. Miles away, in a different time, another man sat in a hospital room, staring at the lifeless body of his son. Michael Hayes had built his fortune on deception. He had climbed the ladder of success by crushing those beneath him. He had gained power, wealth, and influence. And he had sacrificed everything to get it, including his own family. His wife had left him years ago. His son had drifted into rebellion, into addiction, into a life of reckless choices. And now, after years of estrangement, after years of ignoring the signs, after years of turning a blind eye to the damage he had done, his son was gone. A car accident. A night of drinking. A fatal mistake. And Michael? Michael was left sitting in the wreckage, staring at a body he could no longer save, whispering words that came too late. God, if I could take it all back. But the cost had already been paid, because here is the truth no one wants to face. Sin doesn't just affect you. It affects those around you. It affects those who come after you. It affects those who never even knew they were part of your story. And by the time the damage is fully seen, it is often too late to undo it. What comes next? David walked out of the place of worship. His body was weak, his heart was shattered, but he had made a choice to worship even in the face of judgment. Bathsheba still grieved. The kingdom still whispered. The weight of loss still hung over the palace. But David knew one thing. God was not finished with him yet. But what comes next? Can a man truly rebuild after such destruction? Can a king who has fallen ever rise again? Because the cost of sin is great, but the power of redemption is greater. The curse on David's house. There are moments in life when a man believes his worst days are behind him, that the storm has passed, that the price has been paid, that judgment is over. But what if I told you, some sins don't just leave scars, they leave cycles? David thought the worst had already happened. He had wept over his child. He had fasted, prayed, repented. He had walked through the fire of guilt, of sorrow, of regret. He had bowed before God, hoping that his repentance would be enough to undo the damage. But what David didn't realize was that his sin had already taken root in his house. And the thing about seeds? They always grow. Because when a father compromises, his children watch. And when a king falls, his kingdom follows. The sword will never depart. Nathan the prophet had spoken once before. He had stood before David and declared his guilt, exposed his deception, shattered the illusion of control, and now he had returned. The throne room was heavy with the weight of unsaid words. David sat on his throne, his face aged not by time but by grief. He had expected mercy. He had hoped for restoration. But Nathan's expression carried something else. Truth. And truth, when ignored for too long, always returns with a vengeance. The prophet's voice was steady, but his words cut deeper than any blade. This is what the Lord says: the sword will never depart from your house. David's grip tightened on the armrest of his throne. He had heard many prophecies before, of victories, of deliverance, of promises fulfilled. But never one like this, never a prophecy that carried a curse. You took the wife of another man. You murdered to cover your sin. And now the very thing you brought into this house, betrayal, violence, deceit, will consume your sons. What you did in secret will be done to you in the open, before all of Israel. David's heart pounded. The room around him seemed to close in. His past was not buried. His mistakes were not forgotten. His sin was not just his own. It had become an inheritance for the generations that would follow him. Because what if I told you the true cost of sin is not just what you lose, it's what you pass on? The beginning of a broken dynasty. It did not take long for the prophecy to begin unfolding. The judgment was not lightning from heaven. It was not the fall of his throne. It was something much worse. It was his own house turning against itself. David had once been a shepherd, a protector, a father to his people. But now he was a father whose sons carried his worst traits, whose family was unraveling before his eyes. The sin of the father repeated by the son. The first sign came in the form of a name: Amnon, David's firstborn, the heir to the throne. A son who had watched his father take what was not his. A son who had learned that lust was stronger than righteousness. A son who believed that if the king could do it, why couldn't he? Amnon had a desire, an obsession, a craving that should have been resisted. But temptation, once entertained, does not remain silent. It grows, it demands, and Amnon, just like his father before him, gave in to its whispers. His target, his own sister, Tamar. The sin that David had committed in secret, stealing another man's wife, taking what was not his, was now being repeated in the next generation, but worse. It was no longer an affair, it was an act of violence. Amnon deceived, Amnon manipulated. And when the moment came, he did not stop. He did what David had once done. He took what he wanted without thought of the cost. And the moment it was over, Amnon did what every man does after indulging in forbidden lust. He felt disgust, not just for himself, but for the very thing he once craved. He cast Tamar aside, humiliated, broken, discarded like a possession that had lost its value. And here the cycle continued. Because David's sin had not just been against Uriah, it had been against the purity of marriage, against the sacredness of love, against the very heart of God. And now that same sin was living in his own house, poisoning his own children, turning brother against sister. The sword had entered David's house, and it would not leave. A brother's revenge. But the story was not over. Because Tamar was not just anyone, she was the sister of Absalom. And Absalom? He was not a man who forgot. For 2 years he said nothing. 2 years he watched Amnon walk through the palace, untouched, unpunished. 2 years he watched his father, David, the king, do nothing. No justice, no consequence, no accountability. And in those 2 years something grew inside Absalom. A fire, a rage, a hunger not just for revenge, but for power. Because if the king would not act, then perhaps the king did not deserve to rule. And so the son who had once admired his father began plotting against him, slowly, quietly. Just as David had once plotted against Uriah, just as David had once manipulated and deceived, the cycle was repeating. And when the time was right, Absalom struck. He invited Amnon to a feast, a celebration, a brotherly gathering. But when Amnon sat down to eat, he did not know it would be his last meal. Because as soon as the wine was poured, as soon as the laughter filled the room, Absalom gave the order. His men rose, swords were drawn, and before Amnon could even realize what was happening, his own blood was spilled. The firstborn of David, the heir to the throne, dead by the hands of his own brother. And David, who had once written death orders, who had once sent a man to his grave with a letter sealed by his own hand, now received a letter of his own. Your son is dead. And in that moment, David realized the sword was not leaving his house. It had only just begun. A modern-day parallel. A family torn apart. Miles away, in a different time, another father sat in a courtroom, watching the judge deliver a sentence that would tear his family apart forever. Jonathan Myers had built his empire on power, on deception, on self-indulgence. He had cheated in business, lied to his family, broken vows without remorse. He thought his actions only affected him. He thought he was too smart to ever suffer real consequences. But what he never saw coming was that his children had been watching. His oldest son followed in his footsteps. Embezzlement, fraud, a life of corruption. But unlike Jonathan, his son had been caught, and now the judge was reading his sentence. 25 years in prison. Jonathan sat in silence, staring at the reality before him. He had never held a gun, but his actions had fired a shot. He had never stood in a courtroom before, but his sins had led his son here. And now his name, once respected, once feared, was forever tied to shame. Because sin does not end with the sinner, it moves forward, it reaches into the next generation, it poisons bloodlines, it destroys legacies. And by the time the destruction is fully realized, it is already too late. What comes next? David sat in silence. His sons were killing each other. His family was falling apart. His kingdom was beginning to tremble under the weight of his own mistakes. And Nathan's words echoed once more, "The sword will never depart from your house." David had repented, he had been forgiven, but forgiveness does not erase consequences. And now the only question left was this: what would fall next? Because when sin enters a house, it does not stop with one man. It spreads, it consumes, it devours. And David was about to learn that the hardest battles are not fought on the battlefield, but in the house you call home. Lust's long-term damage. Amnon's sin. Some men believe their sins die with them, that if they bury the past deep enough, no one will ever know, that if they repent, the damage they caused will simply disappear. But what if I told you, sin does not just fade away, It grows, it takes root, and sometimes it is your children who reap what you have sown. David had learned the hard way that lust does not stop where you tell it to stop. He had taken another man's wife. He had killed an innocent man to cover his tracks. He had thought that once he repented, the worst was behind him. But sin, real, unchecked sin, never dies quietly. It spreads, it festers, and when the time is right, it destroys. David had tasted its consequences already. His first child with Bathsheba had died. His house was in turmoil, but the worst was yet to come. Because now, the same lust that had overtaken David had taken hold of his own son. And this time it would destroy more than just a marriage. The seed of sin in the next generation. Amnon, the firstborn of David, the crown prince, the heir to the throne, a man who had grown up in the palace, surrounded by power, privilege, and everything his heart could desire. But what happens when a man is given everything except discipline? What happens when a son watches his father take what he wants without restraint, without consequence? What happens when lust is not just a weakness, but a lesson learned from those who came before? Amnon had everything, but the one thing he wanted was forbidden. Her name was Tamar, his half-sister, the daughter of King David, and the full sister of Absalom. She was beautiful, pure, untouched, a young woman with dreams, with dignity, a woman who had no idea that her own brother had become obsessed with her. Because that's how lust works, isn't it? It starts small, a glance, a thought, a lingering desire, a justification, and before you know it, you are no longer in control. The thing you thought you could master is now mastering you. Amnon had watched, had waited, had entertained the thoughts he should have cast down, and now those thoughts had taken hold of him. Now they had become something far darker, a hunger that would not be denied, a craving that would destroy lives. And in this moment, the sins of the father had been passed to the son. The manipulation begins. But Amnon was not reckless, he was not stupid. He knew that if he acted on his desires outright, there would be consequences. So instead, he plotted. And every man who has fallen into deep sin will tell you, the first step is never action, it is deception. Amnon turned to a man named Jonadab, his cousin, a man as wicked as he was cunning. "I am sick with love for my sister Tamar," Amnon confessed, "but I cannot have her." Jonadab smirked. He had seen this before. Desire unchecked, power unrestrained, a man who believed he was above the law. "Then take her," Jonadab said simply, "but do it wisely." He leaned in, whispering a plan, a way to get what Amnon wanted without suspicion, a way to lure Tamar into his grasp without raising alarms. "Pretend to be sick," Jonadab suggested. "When your father, King David, comes to check on you, tell him that you need Tamar to care for you. Ask that she be sent to your chambers to prepare food for you. Then, do as you wish." Amnon listened, and he did exactly as he was told. And here is the tragedy of sin. It rarely walks alone. It always finds an ally, a friend, a voice, a co-conspirator, who will justify what should never be justified. David, unaware of what was unfolding, agreed. He sent Tamar to Amnon's room, never imagining that his own son was leading his daughter into a trap, the crime that could not be undone. Tamar entered the room carrying trays of food, moving with the innocence of someone who had never known betrayal. She was there to serve, to care, to be what she was raised to be, kind, nurturing, compassionate. But Amnon was no longer sick. No, his body was filled with something else. Lust, power, entitlement. As she set the food before him, he grabbed her wrist. His grip was not gentle. Tamar looked up, startled. "My brother, what are you doing?" And in that moment, the line between love and lust was forever shattered. "Come to me, my sister. Lie with me." Tamar's eyes widened. She pulled away. "No, do not do this wicked thing. Such things are not done in Israel. Where would I go with my shame? And you would be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not refuse to give me to you." A desperate plea. A woman trying to reason with a man who had already made up his mind. But lust does not listen to reason. It does not recognize morality. It does not care about right or wrong. It only takes. And Amnon took. He overpowered her, ignored her cries, shattered her innocence, and when it was done, he did what every man consumed by lust eventually does. He despised the very thing he had once desired. The fire that had burned inside him was gone. The obsession had faded, and now all that was left was the consequences. He looked at Tamar, not with love, not with desire, but with disgust. "Get out," he said. Tamar, broken, weeping, pleading, "No, brother, this is worse than what you have already done." But Amnon did not care. He called for his servants, commanded them to throw her out like garbage. A woman he had once longed for, now discarded without a second thought. And here is the final truth of lust. It never satisfies. It only consumes. And when it is finished with you, it spits you out, emptier than you were before. The aftermath, a house divided. Tamar left the palace, her body intact, but her soul shattered. She tore her garments, put ashes on her head, and wept. And when her brother Absalom saw her, he knew. He knew what Amnon had done. He knew what it meant. And he knew that if his father, King David, did not bring justice, then he would. Because here is what David did next. Nothing. The man who had once burned with anger against the rich man who stole a lamb now stood silent as his own son destroyed his daughter's life. The man who had killed to cover his own sin now refused to act when his own children repeated his crimes. And in that silence, another fire was lit. Absalom would not forget, he would not forgive, and soon the consequences of David's sin would spread even further. Because what is sown in lust is always reaped in destruction. A modern-day parallel. The silent father. Miles away, in a different time, another father sat in his office, reading a police report that shattered his world. Jonathan Wells had built his fortune on success, ambition, and control. He had taught his sons to win at all costs. But what he never taught them was restraint. Now his oldest son had been arrested, accused of sexual assault. A young woman, a promising future, now destroyed by a boy who had never been told no. And Jonathan had no words, no defense, because he knew this was not just his son's failure, this was his. What happens next? David sat in his throne room, staring at nothing. His house was in ruins, his children at war, and the prophecy of Nathan echoed in his mind. The sword will never depart from your house. Because sin does not die when the sinner repents. Sometimes it lives on in the ones who come after. Absalom's revenge. If you were challenged, encouraged, or convicted by this message, take a moment to like this video. It helps spread this truth to more people who need to hear it. Leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your struggles, or even a testimony of how God has helped you overcome. This is a community, and your words could be the encouragement someone else needs. And don't forget to subscribe if you want more powerful, faith-based content that speaks truth, exposes lies, and calls you to a higher standard. Then hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Let's fight this battle together. Let's walk in purity. Let's choose God over lust, truth over deception, and holiness over compromise. I'll see you in the next video. Stay strong, stay faithful, and stay in the Word.